thank you, in creating a well-used public transportation system. This is a big issue, and in this one session and in this 1 year, we are not going to fix it all. There are no single magic bullets. But this year, there are a couple of very important opportunities, possibly unprecedented opportunities in this region to make some significant progress in how, as a region, we collectively manage mega projects. And so we are going to be learning about them from our presenters, and learning specifically about what these opportunities are going to be to take action in the coming year. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Laura Tolkoff to talk overall and to situate ourselves in the landscape of mega projects and what the opportunities are to be improving them. And then we're going to be diving into a couple of key opportunities in the coming year, where Ian will be walking us through opportunities to strengthen how we plan and pick projects to build. And in Laura is going to lead us through some opportunities to improve how we advance projects and manage the risk as they move forward. So with that, we'd like to turn this over to Laura.
Thank you, Adina, and thank you everybody for spending your lunch with us, and especially on probably one of the first sunny days in a while. So really appreciate you being here. My name is Laura Tolkoff. I'm SPUR's Transportation Policy Director. For those of you who may not know about SPUR, SPUR is a nonprofit public policy organization that works through research, education, and advocacy to create a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous Bay Area. We've done some work recently on how to improve project cost, quality, schedule in terms of mega projects, but also the smaller projects that are equally important to changing how we move around the region, and encourage you to take a look at that on our website. So as Adina said, I am going to do a very brief kind of Mega Projects 101. If you are interested in this subject, there are a number of sources listed at the end of this slide deck. And I will be doing an injustice to the amount of work that has been done on this topic recently. So definitely encourage you to take a look at that. Next slide, please, Adina. So just very briefly, that is not the right slide. There you go. As I said, I'm going to be doing a very, very high level summary here, and you can also take a look at the slides from the first session if you'd like more information and background on this. But Mega Projects 101, the first point is that, the U.S. in general and California in particular have higher costs and slower delivery of major projects than elsewhere in the world. For instance, the Eno Center found that California's projects, especially those that involve tunneling, cost more than $1 billion per mile, while the costs in countries that are comparable to ours average less than $350 million per mile. Second, there are challenges and opportunities for improvement across the project lifecycle. We'll talk about what we mean when we say project lifecycle, but what that also means is that there's actually many causes and reasons why we see costs escalate and why we see timelines suffer, and that there's no silver bullet, but it's actually, we're going to have to make targeted efforts in multiple ways to kind of address and improve project schedule, cost, and quality. And I think part of that is that, mega projects are notoriously challenging, not just because of the engineering, but because, they are products of people and institutions over many decades, and that makes for a very complicated landscape. So we can't flip a switch and make everything better, but we can start chipping away at some of those causes, and that I think is what we'll be talking about more today. And then third, good projects start with good planning, and the inverse is also true. So there are more than 24 transit agencies and 9 countywide congestion management agencies in the Bay Area, each with its own unique geographies and funding structures, services, priorities. And that can make it really hard to create a shared vision for what the regional transit network can be. And that same dynamic tends to play out on a project by project basis. Each agency has its own priorities driven by business and operational requirements that, again, can make it really challenging sometimes to find common ground or a shared vision. And those differences tend to be solved in numerous ways, such as, increasing the scope or the size of the project, and not necessarily finding, the best and most cost-effective solution. And fourth, across the project lifecycle, there is a need to build up public sector capacity. So if you look at the way other countries plan and deliver mega projects, they tend to be led out of the public sector by really nimble institutions that are have a lot of capacities in-house. And I think, this has been found to be consistently one of the most effective ways to improve project cost, schedule, and quality. Next slide, please. So again,
we're about to get into some detail. So if you have questions, please put your questions into the chat, and we will bunch questions at different points throughout the discussion. So share your questions as you think of them. Go ahead, Laura.
Great. So I think before we begin, we're going to talk, we need to have some words about words so that we all know what we're talking about when we are talking about issues of project delivery. And so we can better understand what it is we're trying to change. So when I'm talking about a mega project life cycle, I'm basically talking about the different phases and stages that you see here on this slide. I would say that this life cycle is a little prototypical. It's somewhat simplified. It's not always quite so neat as this or as linear. But what it is, in the project life cycle, there are roughly 3 phases: project selection, which you see in orange, project development and definition, which you see in green, and then project delivery is is the phase that you see in blue. And each of those phases is made up of different stages, as you can see by each arrow. Next slide, please. So the first, go back. Yeah, there you are. So project selection, this is really when you start choosing which projects to build. And here in the Bay Area, that really begins with regional planning. So some entity in our region, that's our MTC, is responsible for establishing a vision for the regional transit network and which projects are needed to actually build out that vision. And of course, a project may go through other conceptual planning before it even enters into the RTP. But since this is where political and financial commitments tend to get made, we think about this as the conception of a project. Then you move into the second phase, project definition and development. And generally, there are about 3 stages. So the first is project initiation. And this is where the different options for projects are evaluated and you kind of select what your preferred option is. So you might be thinking about, how do I make this connection between point A and point B? Is the best mode going to be a bus? Is it going to be light rail? Is it going to be heavy rail? Those kind of technology decisions are the type that start to get indicated at that point. The second step here is preliminary design, or rather the third step, but the second in this phase is preliminary design. So you're going to start refining that preferred option, conducting the environmental analysis and clarifying kind of the scope of what that project is. So what it is, what its route might be, how many stations you might have, things like that. And you're going to clarify that scope and start refining your cost estimates. Then there's detailed design. This is where, again, this is where it also starts to not be as linear. Sometimes this happens once you've already procured your contractors. It depends on your delivery option, but for the sake of this is where, you're refining your preferred option even further. You're finalizing those project designs and requirements, like operating requirements for the operating agency. And you're starting to really think about your delivery options. Who is going to deliver the project? What type of procurement structure might you need, et cetera. And then things start to shift into the part that people refer to as project delivery, and that phase is really about procurement, construction, and bringing the project into service, and then ultimately close out. So this is where when we talk about delivery, we're talking about doing the contracting work to prepare a project for market, determining the workforce requirements, and bringing on that contractor. Construction is what it sounds like, building it, starting to test the systems, and then bringing your transit system into service. Closeout, this is monitoring the project's performance and evaluating, what went well, what didn't, and learning from the entire process. So that is what we mean by the project life cycle. Next slide, please. I think, as we mentioned in the beginning, there are challenges that tend to emerge, all throughout a project's life cycle. Sometimes early on in the project selection phase, we end up committing to projects too early, right? So I think projects tend to become real very early here in the region. We set policy expectations around cost or scope that can be pretty speculative at this very early regional transportation plan stage. And I think the reality is that projects can change a lot, and often should change a lot because they're committed to at a very early point. But what it does do is kind of set public expectations, for instance, to a certain number about a project or about the project's budget, or the mode that may be used, or the stations and cities that might be served, when in reality the project is very subject to change, but you've already set public expectations around it in one direction. You also see a lot of projects in the project, a lot of challenges emerge in the project definition and development phase. In fact, most of the projects that you'll see a headline about, most of the problems start well before that project has broken ground. They start really in that project definition and development phase. And so I'm not going to go into detail on these, but I think, one of those examples, a few of those that, you might hear about are things like lock-in and path dependency, where you commit as an agency to a specific project or a specific design before a formal decision to build, or before really understanding what the consequences of that are on cost or schedule, or customers. Another example would be betterments. I think this is something a lot of people talk about, that transportation projects tend to become not just transportation projects. Oftentimes anything that's going to touch the street or the sidewalk, a CPUC equivalent, or the city might request that the agency replace all the lighting or all the sewers. And so those costs get bundled into the cost of the project. Same thing often happens with mitigation. So the cost of building a new parking structure, which I have my own commentary on, often gets incorporated into the cost of a transit project. So the numbers really grow, and some people think about this as the cost of doing business, but it is an expensive cost. So again, there are many challenges that emerge. A lot of them really start in this project definition and development phase. Next slide, please. And if you can click it again. I think it's important to situate current regional efforts for reform within this life cycle. And the reforms that we're talking about today, the work that's happening at the regional level, are really situated at addressing the project selection issues, which Ian will talk about, and the project definition and development issues. And I want to say that that is okay. It's not pure project delivery, but it does have a real bearing on project outcomes in terms of cost, quality, and schedule, because the majority of the problems start in this phase. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity to kind of get at some of those root causes. And I think, it is, of course, not the only fix that's needed, but it's in a really important way to start chipping away at this problem. And I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Ian.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
Go ahead.
Do you want to do this slide first?
Sure. Sorry. So, segue into this, there are two opportunities for change. So the first is Transit 2050 Plus. It's sometimes referred to as a connected network plan, and Ian will talk a little bit about that. And what that is really doing is focusing on the issue of project selection through the stage of regional planning. And then the second one is MTC is working on and adopting a major project advancement policy, which is intended to help reduce risk through the project definition and development stages. So I'll turn it over to Ian from here.
Great, thank you, Laura. Again, I'm Ian Griffiths, Policy Director for Seamless Bay Area, and I'll be talking about this opportunity of the Connected Network Plan. So if you can go to the next slide. So thinking about how we currently do project selection, or I would say identification. All right, I'm seeing this is some of the edits I made to this are not being shown in the slide you're currently sharing, but hopefully as we go through, the changes will be reflected. So essentially, it's very much a bottom-up process right now in terms of how we identify which major new terminals, mega projects, new lines, new corridors get into our list of priorities and into our regional plan, which is called Plan Bay Area currently. The project ideas are generated at a agency level, or sometimes at a county or municipal level, like a certain rail extension or ferry terminal in say that WIDA wants to build, the ferry authority, or BART may have an extension idea, or VTA may have a light rail idea. Those get submitted through a formal process. There's a scoring process that's done through the regional plan by which the performance of each project is measured and the impact on ridership and whatever metrics we want to use. And then that leads to a ranking of the projects in our regional plan, which identifies the highest priority projects for funding. That's how we currently do things. And the result, if you go to the next slide, is a bottom-up and a fiscally constrained plan, which means this is something that's required as part of this regional planning process. It's a plan that only includes things that we can identify funding for. That current funding, the current plan, Plan Bay Area 2050, which was adopted a few years ago, does assume that we're going to pass some kind of major regional ballot measure within the next few years. So it includes some very aspirational projects like Link 21, the second Transbay crossing. But what it doesn't include is it's not based around a comprehensive vision for an integrated network. And MTC actually acknowledged this recently. That advocates are correct in pointing out that, and this is a quote from a recent presentation that they gave, that the plan does not include a vision of a network to identify what those projects are. So that's really the fundamental shift that's happening as a result of advocacy, really. So if you can go to the next slide. What the ideal process should be, and this is a graphic, the graphic on this page and the prior slide come from the SPUR's really excellent report on this topic, which is that we start with the vision of what we're trying to achieve, a strategic regional plan that identifies in an agency agnostic way that are not crowdsourced from agencies and local authorities only, that of course would include the input of those agencies, but it starts with a vision of what we're trying to actually build out in terms of a long-term network. And that helps us identify, well, what are the projects that we need to get us there? What are the rail terminals? What are the multimodal corridors that we need to plan for? And then thinking about how we actually deliver on those things. And some of those projects may not fit neatly within one municipality or one existing transit agency's current authority. So it's a really great opportunity to be able to identify all of the things that are needed to build a more people-centered network as opposed to an agency, a project that reflects existing agency boundaries. So if you go to the next slide, sorry, there should have been an animation there, but that's one of the things I added in. But this was this is called the Connected Network Plan, and this idea of doing a strategic regional transit plan was included in the set of recommendations that came out of our Blue Ribbon Task Force's Transformation Action Plan. That was done as part of COVID. It was one of 27 actions that was identified as critical for us to be able to, set ourselves on a much stronger trajectory moving forward. So, what would a service vision for Bay Area transit look like? Well, advocates have developed them. This is Seamless Bay Area's service vision map that we developed really as an advocacy strategy a few years ago. SPUR has also developed a vision map. It's a map that includes all of the types of service on one map that and includes a sense of the frequency and speed and the target travel times between different destinations. So this is Seamless's map that was done really as a way of illustrating what this could look like and why and how it would be so powerful in terms of how we do project advancement. You can see different levels of service associated with each of these different colored lines that are not based around what agency boundaries are, but really based on the level of connectivity that we're trying to achieve. So the dark red would be the highest capacity transit lines with the greatest frequency and service. We have regional lines in green. We have local service or high quality local service corridors identified in orange. And then the key hubs throughout the network where people are expected to make connections called out very clearly on this vision. So if you go to the next slide, Seattle is an example, just a couple of examples of other regions that have done this. Seattle's regional plan is based around a service-based vision or I should say the Puget Sound region, which is the region that Seattle is in, where they've really started with a vision of an integrated network. That network is based around very ambitious goals that are connected to our broader climate goals. In Seattle, it's based around this fundamental goal of increasing, doubling transit use and increasing the amount of jobs that are within a quarter mile of transit by 50%. And then identifying the time savings that need to be built into the overall network that should be driving the identification of key projects. Again, in an agency and mode agnostic way. Another example, the country that has probably had the longest track record of doing this is Switzerland. They kind of pioneered this, particularly in the rail domain. This is how Switzerland begins with a sense of the amount of time it should take to get between key hubs at a countrywide scale. And the country of Switzerland is not much bigger in terms of population or size, geography than the Bay Area. So they've started from a vision of travel times between their key urban centers across the country. Then if you click to the next slide, that is translated into identifying the levels of service, which corridors should have service every 15 minutes. This is again at a national scale, which corridors should have every half-hour rail service. Then they go down even within each of those regions within Switzerland, which are in the yellow circles. They have a similar level of detail at the regional scale for local service. And that's how they identify their list of capital project priorities and how they proceed with knowing with certainty that, that they're spending public money, that they're investing in the projects that are going to build out this vision of the network in a way that's very much coordinated with the rest of the planning for the region and for the country. Okay, next slide. Next slide. All right, so the effort going on currently that's been announced that was called the Connected Network Plan in the Transformation Action Plan. It is now being sort of called Transit 2050. That is the name of the exercise of creating the Bay Area's service-based vision. And that will be done as part of the update to Plan Bay Area 2050, our regional plan that MTC is obligated to update anyway every 4 or 5 years. So while we've historically not been necessarily, there's been problems with Plan Bay Area 2050, it's really great that this new, better method of planning for integrated transit is being built into our existing planning process rather than creating a separate planning process, that could be duplicative or perhaps in conflict. And because Plan Bay Area is the process used for prioritizing capital projects, it's great that this new method is going to be incorporated into Plan Bay Area 2050. So if you go to the next slide, this is the timeline that MTC has shared for how this is going to be proceeding. So basically in the next 6 months, winter and spring, even fewer than 6 months, we're going to be taking on the first 2 steps of this project being led by MTC and in partnership with the transit agencies. There's a sort of joint project management structure with MTC and transit agencies co-leading this initiative, where they're first starting by identifying what are the hubs, the key corridors in the regions, what are the gaps, then that leading to the identification and generation of project ideas, some of which we may have heard of before, but some which may be entirely new project ideas that have never surfaced before because there wasn't an agency responsible for identifying that project. That's the opportunity that we have by going through this process. Projects like the Dumbarton corridor that, for example, have really fallen between different transit agencies' core responsibilities. We may see that projects like that get an added level of emphasis as being critical to the overall vision for an integrated network. And then, of course, the evaluation of those project ideas I think what we hope will be a much stronger ranking of the priorities of those projects, and projects that are going to be coordinated ideally. So if there's any at all duplicative projects, that would get identified and sorted through as part of this process. So this entire project process will take about 18 months. And it really sets us up for the opportunity to be able to, when we next have the opportunity to advance a regional funding measure, to be bringing voters a vision of what a connected network looks like that we want them to fund both the capital projects, the mega projects that we want to fund, as well as the operating funding that's needed to run the service with a greater level of confidence than I think we've been able to do in past funding measures that we've brought to voters. So my last slide is this one, just a summary of the desired outcome, and again, what you can do. So what we want to see, what I think Seamless and SPUR would like to see out of this process, and hopefully many of you, is a really visionary long-term plan for what connected seamless transit looks like at our region. Coming out of this connected network plan, those major hubs, corridors, target travel times, service frequencies, and the levels of service, as well as the policies that go alongside that, like integrated fares, an estimation of the funding required to build that out. And we hope that, and it may happen in parallel or as part of the connected network plan process, so really an identification of some of the reforms, including the governance reforms that are needed to then deliver on that vision. And then what you can do is really participate in the process and keep tabs, especially considering there's going to be so many different agency meetings to follow. So participate in work to actually create the map and the vision within the first half of this year. Keep track of the identification and evaluation of the projects as those come to different MTC and transit agency board meetings. Monitoring the consistency of what is coming out of this process with what may be coming forth and presented to agency boards, and making sure that we're we're highlighting the importance of consistency across what agencies are doing and what MTC is doing. And then all along, I think it's important to surface, that the importance of pairing this long-term visioning with the governance and institutional reforms that are needed to realize that vision. That includes, network management reforms, which we haven't talked about today, but which many of you are keeping track of as well. There's rail governance reforms being developed, as well as identifying better institutions for delivering capital projects. So I'll stop there, and I think we're going to have time for a few questions now before we go on to the second part of the presentation. Is that right, Adina?
Yeah, I'll actually, given the timing and where we are, let's move over to Laura for the second piece of the presentation, and then take the questions at the end. And as you have questions, please share them in the comments so that we can get to as many of them as possible. And I'll move this on to Laura, because in addition to the planning phase, there's opportunities to make improvements on project advancement as well.
Great, thank you. Perfect segue. So I will be talking about the second opportunity here. Next slide. And so MTC is currently working on a major project advancement policy, which is intended to be a few things. And before we get into that, I think it's sort of important to understand a little bit about what MTC's current authority is and relationship to mega projects is. So, currently MTC doesn't deliver projects or directly oversee projects, and plays a relatively minor role in funding them directly. A lot of the funding for capital projects comes through local measures, federal funding where applicable, and state grant programs. And what that means is that there are many players in mega projects, in making mega projects come to life, and MTC's power is pretty diffuse, and has relatively little control over specific projects in the current state. Where they do have a lot of influence is over projects that is over the regional transportation plan. And as Ian said, whether a project is in or out of that regional transportation plan really matters, because transit projects need to be included in the RTP, the regional transportation plan, in order to be eligible for major sources of federal and state funding. So that decision to include it or a project or not is a really key lever for MTC. And they can also influence whether the eligible projects can access major sources of federal and state funding. And the way that happens is through, an endorsement or prioritization policy for federal and state grants. That is sort of the current levers that there are now. And I think there's a really broad recognition among commissioners and the public that, MTC has a really strong interest in ensuring that major transit capital projects are delivered on time and on budget as part of a strategically sequenced regional portfolio, even though they do not directly deliver projects. And the reason for this is that, they are in charge of kind of distributing funding, and when projects are delayed or require new money because they are over budget, it really affects other regions in the project's pipeline. And so if you think about MTC as sort of a portfolio manager in some ways of investments, they have a really strong interest in reforming this. Next slide, please. So the major project advancement policy is something that MTC kicked off last year, and it was really the purpose of it is really focused on regionally significant projects in the Plan Bay area. So these larger mega projects really. And, you know, MTC's purpose with the map is to do three things. One is prioritize and sequence federal, state, and regional discretionary funding requests. So, you know, which projects should be applying to the FTA, the Federal Transportation Authority, for a capital investment grant in 2023 versus 2024. That's an example. The second thing it's intended to do is really develop and evolve MTC's role in risk management, again, because their role is quite limited now, but there's a reason for them to do more. And then the third is to make sure that the projects that get built, you know, are consistent with regional policies, such as the transit-oriented communities policy, or others. And so the MAP, the Major Project Advancement Policy, was split into kind of three different phases. The funding strategy, really part one, that you see here, was adopted in October 2022. And the issue around policy reinforcements and risk management are really underway right now, with a target for adoption in the spring. Next slide. I think one of the things that is important is the MAP framework is really modeled after stage gates. And so stage gates is really a system of checks and balances between each of those stages and phases that we showed in the diagram early on in our presentation, where agencies are basically expected to meet certain thresholds around risk, scope, funding, or deliverability along each stage of the project before they can sort of advance to the next stage. So it's explicitly patterned after the stage gate process, which is used as a best practice around the world. And they intend to really further reinforce this approach with those risk management and policy reinforcements. And again, it's a way to kind of manage the progression of really complicated projects to ensure readiness and quality and cost control. And for anyone who's this is an image of kind of a conceptual image of what Network Rail in England uses, but there are many countries around the world with their own versions of a stage gate. Next slide. To be clear, before we go into this, these are SPUR slides, not MTC slides. So this is our explanation of this, but basically the MAP funding strategy that was adopted in October established 4 different MAP levels that essentially group and sequence projects from Plan Bay area based on their readiness and funding status. And so they used these different levels to establish those funding endorsements. And so MAP level 1 are projects that are getting pretty close to construction. So they are projects where they have over half of their funding committed and are anticipated to start construction by 2028. An example of that would be the extension of BART to San Jose and Santa Clara, essentially BART phase 2, that is in MAP level 1. On the other end of the spectrum, you have MAP level 4, which are tier 2 Plan Bay area 2050 projects. So these are ones that, you know, are still very much in early days in their project development and definition. And, you know, that's where they are in their life. And then MAP level 2 and 3, you know, these are somewhere in the middle. An example of a MAP level 2 project is one that's kind of moving out of their project definition phase and starting to get ready for things like procurement and solidifying their federal funding. And so an example of that would be the downtown extension project in San Francisco. Next slide. So, these levels are intended to kind of be the basis for those policy reinforcements, and could potentially be those policy reinforcements could potentially be expanded as time goes on and for each of the levels. And so to advance between each of the levels, again, this is a stage gate process where they are managing the progression of projects based on certain criteria around funding, readiness, risk, and policy thresholds. There's an intent basically for the map levels to help sequence those projects for capital funding while also ensuring project quality. This is an example. What you see below is an expected way for projects to advance through those map levels. Next slide. Yes, thank you, Adrian. It is renamed the portal. This is a poor habit that I've forgotten to replace that in my brain. So thank you. Yes, the portal. The challenge here, I think, the major advancement project is major advancement policy, or MAP, is something that's really important and really has the potential to be very effective at addressing some of those problems in project development and definition. But I think it's going to take some time to get to that place. So I think it's something that's really great for sequencing projects of funding for funding opportunities, as was established back in October. And I think, as advocates, there are a few things where we can continue to advocate for some changes to really strengthen this policy, to progressively make it stronger over time. And some of the ways to do that, I think, are making sure that, the map levels are really correlating to and having a strong relationship with other externally imposed deadlines, where the scope of a project gets fixed in some way. So if you remember that diagram that I showed you in the beginning, making sure that, this is well timed to things like applying for federal grants, or to the environmental scoping and final environmental documents, where a lot of decisions about project design tend to get fixed in place and locked in, because in order for the map to be really credible, it needs to also be really well timed and able to affect change within each of those windows. The second thing is that, I think it should come with new staffing. MTC is not currently staffed to engage in sort of really robust project delivery or mega project oversight. And so this is something where adding that capacity to the organization, that experience to be able to bring best practices and apply them here, is something that's really important, and something that, they'll need to grow into in order to be effective. And then third, there's certainly a role for, I think, legislative reinforcements or new funding sources that could further strengthen their authority. So right now, MTC is working to take on sort of a bigger role that expands on their the threshold question of, are you in or out of the RTP? But I think there certainly could be other efforts that could further empower MPOs to really tie funding decisions to project outcomes. And then similarly, having additional funding at the regional level that could be applied to capital projects would certainly also give them additional, I think, weight in the oversight of these projects. So these are a couple of things where there are both challenges and opportunities to kind of strengthen the major project advancement policy over time, to influence the outcomes of projects that are in earlier stages of development. So I think next slide, I think that might be So this is just a timeline here that's intended to kind of synthesize each of the efforts that Ian and I talked about and kind of put them in relationship to each other. So what you can see over, we're talking about really three things here that are in relationship to each other. The Regional Transportation Plan, Plan Bay Area, the Major Project Advancement Policy or MAP, and the Connected Network Plan. So what you see here is, MTC adopted Plan Bay Area 2050 in 2021, and it's in the process of doing one of their updates to it. That's going to be informed by the Connected Network Plan, also called Transit 2050 Plus. That service vision is going to be an input to Plan Bay Area 2050 Plus, that update to the RTP. In parallel, they're developing the Major Project Advancement Policy, which is going to inform, I think, the sequencing of projects and what gets kind of selected as part of Transit 2050 Plus and Plan Bay Area 2050 Plus, that Plan Bay Area update. And then, once you have that transit vision, that service vision in place, I think it's going to kind of necessitate a hard look at what projects we have previously committed to building and really adjust that in terms of our policy and funding priorities. So that goes back to the map again. So it's a bit of an iterative cycle, but they are moving forward in a way that I think is set up to really influence each other well to make a big difference in really what we're choosing to build and those early phases where most of those challenges really take root. Next slide.
All right, so I think that we are going, given the fact that where we are in the schedule for today's event and the fact that the regional rail material has been slower to surface than we expected when we planned this, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just wanted to let everyone here know that there's a regional rail study in the works that does have the potential to improve major projects. Expect public meetings in February, and we'll keep you posted on some more opportunities to take action. At this point, I would like to stop and take questions. If you have a question, please do type it into the chat or raise a hand, and I'll leave up what our timeline is going to be for activity on these in these opportunities for improvement. I see that someone had asked a question about tunneling techniques and technologies. Where in the overall picture of improving major projects would we are there opportunities to refine which, whether we're using the right technologies for each project?
I think it's not, I think it's I would just say it would be both in the project identification, understanding what the goal is and ensuring that our projects are based around clear service vision goals of how many people are we trying to transport from A to B at what speed, and then I think also in the procurement methods, which as Laura said, not being dealt with through either of the two initiatives that we went through today, but in terms of how we then put out a request to market for folks to bid on a project, if we're specifying very exactly what the technology they need to be using is, or if we're basing it more on the performance outcomes that we're trying to seek of, and then allowing through our procurement processes, innovations that might be able to include novel ways of tunneling that we don't necessarily know how to do. But that would be both making sure that we're framing projects in terms of the outcomes that they're trying to build and not specifying exactly how it's going to get built, and then also the way we do procurement. If you might answer that.
Yeah. So I see that. Jeffrey asked, how do I participate in the project identification phase? the key thing this year is going to be to participate in the Connected Network Plan effort that will be picking up throughout the year. And you can follow along through MTC. And since you are now on this seamless list, you will be getting updates on opportunities to participate in that, because that Connected Network Plan will be setting the goals and then identifying what projects helped to achieve those goals. Steve Ungerth says thoughts about involving transit unions as stakeholders in the process. And Laura or Ian, do you have thoughts? And if not, I can chime in.
Go ahead. I feel like I've talked a lot.
Go ahead.
Okay. So particularly with the Connected Network Plan, MTC has identified stakeholder outreach as part of this process, and they should be working with unions, including unions as stakeholders. And if you have some more ideas about how to do that better, I will be happy to catch up with you offline. I also have a different hat serving with a couple of people on this call on MTC's Policy Advisory Council, and can make some recommendations about stakeholder engagement with that hat. I see that Howard Wong, who's also on the Policy Advisory Council, has a hand.
Yes. The 2050 is a long way away, and yet we see increased technology changes and mobility patterns in the current time frame. So in the next 5 years or 10 years, we're seeing mobility patterns and technology that could be transformational. So to plan with conventional, concepts and not look at the revolutionary potential of automated transit, micro-mobility, of all types of integration of systems and coordination through technology. I think that needs to be a big part of the planning.
Okay, so Ian or Laura, thoughts about in Plan Bay Area 2050, how to be taking into account things that are changing more rapidly than 2050?
I would agree. I think I agree, and I think Howard, what you're bringing up kind of speaks to a little bit of a branding problem that is with the name that they've selected for Transit 2050. Because yeah, it doesn't feel particularly like it's going to be useful it's going to impact our lives anytime soon with that name. But I do think it does have the potential to, as soon as it's completed, really inform how we go, within the next couple of years, how we go about identifying project priorities. So I think the policy ideas that you're bringing up should be, I think they're important ideas to be bringing up during the outreach of this next 18 months, and are consistent with focusing again on outcomes, not like a light rail line here or a heavy rail line here or this particular type of conventional transit here, but to say these are areas where people need to be able to show up and get us something every X number of minutes, or these are areas for on-demand service, or these are key hubs where people should be able to make seamless transfers, among modes, and not specifying, are we using a train that requires an operator, or are we using a bus, the way that we currently understand buses, but so that as technology, if there's technologies that develop that are able to deliver on those outcomes, and they're not necessarily what we know of today, we can match those new technologies to the corridors and the the vision that we are trying to achieve. But I think what you're saying is like, let's think even beyond that. And I think that's an important reminder that the plan shouldn't be too specific and should allow for the flexibility for those innovative ideas to be kind of leveraged. But I think it's also important to have, I would also say it's also important for us to have a plan so that we understand as these innovations come up, we understand, do these technologies help us build out the vision that we agreed upon, or are these just ideas that are captivating, but maybe they don't actually help us advance the vision we're trying to build? And I think a lot of innovations are like solutions in search of a problem, as opposed to like there's a lot of innovative ideas that like, sound cool, but like we need a clear policy vision and a clear network vision to know whether, okay, does that technology actually help us build out the thing that we agreed that we want to build, or is it just sound cool?
Okay, so it is 1 o'clock and we had planned this to go through 1. Might our panelists be able to stay on to take another couple of questions if people have them? All right, so if we can stay for another small number of questions if anybody has them, and if people need to go, thank you very much. We will be sharing the recording, we will be sharing the references, and we will be sharing the chat. So Varun asks, how are anticipated changes in land use accounted for? So this is, I'll take this one. This is one of the really exciting opportunities in the connected network plan, because it is being woven into the update of Plan Bay Area. There is definitely an opportunity to do this planning in sync with land use plans and land use policies. And so for people who are paying attention in the coming year, this is a key opportunity for those to be done together. Let's see.
Yeah, I'll just add that the modeling of the effectiveness of these transit investments and corridors will take into account planned land use intensification that is consistent with where, the corridors and the policies that we've adopted. So those projects, those transit projects that reinforce our land use goals should score better because we're doing them as part of one modeling process. And that's the idea behind Plan Bay Areas. It's both a transportation plan and a housing plan done together.
So Jeffrey Rose asks an important question, which is, there's a lot of change in work patterns and how they may change the needs of future transit networks. Can Laura and or Ian talk about how it may make sense to take into account those changes in travel patterns? And note that I said travel patterns, I did not just say commute patterns.
I mean, I think they are changing. I think that we don't fully have a clear picture of that, to be honest. I think because the federal government stepped in nationwide with a lot of support, we haven't had to grapple with the nature of those changes as much as we are going to have to in coming months and years. And so I think, yes, the economic geography of the nation, and especially California and especially the Bay Area, does appear to be changing. And I think I think it's spot on. I don't think we quite know yet, but it's something that as we think about what needs to be the new business model for transit and different types of transit, it has to be a big part of the consideration. And I also think that, even if, let's say, and I am going to use the word commute trips have declined and will persistently stay declining, we still know that we need to drastically shift the number of trips and the proportion of all trips that we are taking on transit. So we need to be thinking about, yes, for those shorter trips, what's a better, more sustainable solution, and how does transit fit into that?
Okay, Ian, and if you don't, I'll jump in with another.
I was just going to say, generally, I think the connected network plan is a better method to it really starts from the point of like, and it's more of an anywhere to anywhere plan of like how long should it take to get between basic, like anywhere to anywhere in the Bay Area, assuming people are going to be making all types of trips, and transit should be competitive for, like transit should be competitive with driving, across an entire network and across an entire region. So I think that the overall method for developing the plan, again, which has been tested out in many other regions, including for many decades now in Switzerland and Germany, is a more resilient, is going to result in a more resilient and flexible overall plan, rather than, a plan that focuses on just, getting people to downtown San Francisco, which is kind of how we've, the prior planning processes have lent themselves to being less flexible because they're more based on, they're not based on delivering a certain network. So that's not going to guarantee that we're going to result in a more resilient plan, but I do think if we do this well, we'll end up with a plan that is going to be far more flexible to adapt to not only this pandemic, but future events that we can't predict, and providing the region with robust competitive transit options that provide a competitive transit travel time between all parts of the region. We may not get the capacity exactly right. Maybe there's certain corridors we'll have to beef up capacity on as commute patterns continue to change, but at least we can start by building up the service on those areas where currently they've been neglected, or we don't have at all transit, competitive transit travel times between so many parts of our region.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add in, before transitioning to the next and last question, is that in parts of the world that have had a higher transit share of travel than the Bay Area did, the United States in general has had an over-focus on commute trips and an under-focus on other types of trips that people take throughout the day and week. So this is an opportunity to do something that we were underserving all along, which is to make the public transportation system useful for many types of route trips and many types of riders. And that strategy, parts of the world, including Vancouver, was up at 80% of their pre-pandemic ridership, and was one of many parts of the world that designed their transportation system for more types of riders and more types of trips, and therefore maintained ridership better. Last question was, I'm going to generalize the question about a particular project that was advanced and selected with an extremely strong local advocacy, and arguably may or may not have been. We're not going to have the debate about a particular project here, but in our historical planning process, it's been done by having each jurisdiction submit their projects, and so very high priority and things that had very fierce local championship that may or may not have created the best network. Any thoughts on how the changes being done now might be able to help with that balance between local championship and making the best network?
I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'd admit that pretty much every project we've ever built has started off that way in the region. And so I think as Ian described, there is this process right now. The way that we choose projects really stems from that model of nominating through fierce local advocacy for a specific project. And oftentimes those projects that sort of fall between the cracks or may be important from a regional or statewide significance, but who don't have a logical champion, those fall through the cracks, right? And so I think what is intended to be the outcome of a service-based vision is that it's really starting from the premise or the question of how do we connect people and places? And so it should, in theory, be rationalizing the list of projects that we actually need to build. And so I think, that is really key to kind of disrupting the current model that we've had, or the model that we've had historically.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It is now 1:10, and so we're at time, plus overtime for questions. So thanks very much for your good questions, for your attention. We'll be following up with the slides and the references and the opportunities to take action. So this is a big problem and a big issue and a big set of needs. So it's going to take all of our attention to continue to improve how we do mega projects in the Bay Area. Thank you very much. And thanks you to the speakers for something that's really informative and useful.
Thanks for being
Thanks,
here. Thanks for
everyone.
hosting.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.